Thank you for downloading this RealAgriculture podcast. Excite your crops with inputs from Excite Bio. Access nitrogen and phosphorus with Excite Bio's lineup of inoculants and ag biologicals. Since 2010, they've been helping farmers harness the power of the soil. Learn more at excitebio.ca. That's XITEBIO.ca.
Good day, and welcome to Wheat Pete's Word here on Real Agriculture for Wednesday, February the 28th. On this episode of The Word, great news for Wheat Pete. Oh, the markets. What's the reality? We have to look at that. Hey, is it spring or is it winter? Depends on where you're living. And lots of cool questions that I hope I get to before I run out of time yet again. Let's go. First off, yes, welcome Reggie, another grandchild added to the Johnson clan. It just keeps growing, and that is amazing. Grandkids are so much fun. Jack sending me an excellent picture of himself out skiing with his grandchildren today. Yes, Wednesday, February 28th. It's amazing. There's still snow up at Blue Mountain, Jack, but just made me smile that he's there with his grandkids. And whether it's kids or grandkids, please appreciate life, because we have some stresses. There's no doubt we have some stresses. But in general terms, for most of us, I hope all of us, life is pretty good. On that note, the Farmer Sentiment Index. So Real Agriculture, everyone may not be aware of this, but Sean Haney does great job of surveying farmer results. The Farmer Sentiment Survey that just came back, ugly low. And the markets, oh my gosh, they just keep going down. And everyone I talk to says, why didn't I sell at harvest? Why didn't I sell ahead of harvest? Wheat Pete is in that boat. Way too many bushels in the bin. But I really did hear a couple of great speakers, in particular Steve Kells, and his message was, have realistic targets. We got spoiled the last couple of years with prices that were well above what realistic targets should have been. And Brian sending me some great charts where he looks at the 12-year average. And you know what? If you take out those two really spiked years of 2021 and 2022, man, prices are back right around average. In fact, they're probably a hair over average in many cases, and I get it. I get that it's not $10 wheat, and I wish I would have sold more $10 wheat. But set those realistic targets and don't have unrealistic goals. I think we just have to get there from that standpoint. And what this all really does is up the stress incredibly. I've had several people reach out to me just saying, wow, maybe they've had an added stress, a neighbor has passed away, or someone got injured, and you look at the economics of agriculture today. Another client saying that, I'm so glad I did not pay $500 an acre to keep renting those acres. I hated to let them go, but now you look at the economics. So there's a lot of stress out there, and what does Wheat Pete say when there's stress? It's time to go back to the Wheat Pete 15. Please pick up the phone, call a neighbor, call a friend, call an acquaintance, and just ask, how are you? No, I mean, really, how are you? And even if they're fine, if you call Wheat Pete is fine. But if you call them, it's going to make them feel even better. It's a bit like on Tech Talk Tuesdays. I always have a pep talk. And by the way, we're done Tech Talk Tuesdays now for 2024. What a great run. But when I have the panelists there before we go live, one of the comments always is, smile if you can, because if we're having fun, the audience has fun. And I said that once, and Tracy Bowdy was one of the panelists. And as soon as I said smile, she did smile, and I just whoosh, my whole attitude just lifted up another notch. It was really fun to see the impact of that. So smile, have some fun. call someone because there's lots of stress out there. That's just the reality. Okay, I want to move on and just say, yeah, spring. Wow, they are planting corn to beat heck in Texas and in Missouri. And the weather here in Ontario has been really weird in February until last night or yesterday. I talked to Nature Nut Nick at the Middlesex Soil and Crop meeting, and if I recall his number correctly, it was 3 millimeters of precipitation in February up until the rain that we got yesterday and last night. And we normally get 65 to 70 millimeters. No snow at all in February. And so it has been dry, and that makes us think it's early. Meanwhile, James up at Cache Bay is saying, I don't know about this, Peter, because it's minus 17 coming. We had thunderstorms, a ton of rain, and now the weather looks like minus 17. What about the wheat? What about the alfalfa? So the question back to James, do you still have snow? He said, yes, 4 to 6 inches of saturated wet slop. Well, that is still some insulation for those crops. Down here in Ontario, I think certainly the rye, the triticale, the wheat, they have all pretty much started to grow. And as Dr. Dave said last night on Tech Talk Tuesdays, they can ebb and flow. If we get 3 or 4 days of colder temperatures, they will acclimate to that and tolerate lower temperatures. The real risk is kind of what James up at Cache Bay is concerned about. It's the plus 10, the plus 12, and then the immediate snap right down to minus 17. If that happens, we can get cold injury, and we can actually get winter kill on all of those crops. But 4 to 6 inches of wet snow sitting there, and the chance of snow before it gets cold, get another, centimeter or 2 or inch of fluffy white snow on top, I think you're still okay. I'm not all that worried. Hey, the other thing about Tech Talk Tuesday last night, really astounding. We talked about winter canola. Man, it is really an interesting crop because it can get frozen really hard and all the leaves disappear and you think it's done, but as long as that growing point is alive, it'll set more flowers. It keeps going. It really is resilient from that cold temperature standpoint. So really cool discussion around that last night. But it is go time now. So for sure. And by the way, even last week, I think I said that it's okay for clover. The real risk on clover is that it germinates and it grows, it continues warm, and it gets past the unifoliate stage. So it comes up with its cotyledons, gets a nice little unifoliate, and then it makes the first trifoliate. If clover or alfalfa get to the first trifoliate stage, they lose their cold tolerance. Up until first trifoliate stage, they are really cold tolerant. First trifoliate stage, 2 hours of minus 4 Celsius, and they're dead. So the real concern is that they germinate and grow, and they get to the first trifoliate stage or the second trifoliate stage, and then we get a cold snap that goes below minus 4. But to get it out there early, get the frost action to work that into the ground a little bit, to let it get started with ample moisture, I just think it's absolutely time. And so get that job done if you can at all. Even Nature Nut Nick went out to before the rain happened, and frost seeded some oats out into his corn stalks where his cereal rye didn't catch. So man, if Nick's running, then for sure it is time to start. Meanwhile, on the clover, there is a little bit of discussion as well about single cut versus double cut. Dave asking me, he's saying, wow, double cut clover is really expensive. I can buy single cut for less money. How does that shake out? And so the answer is that in the data, single cut is 90% the value of double cut. We would give double cut clover, a good stand of double cut clover, a 75-pound nitrogen credit. Single cut gets a 68-pound nitrogen credit. And Dave asked a great question. He said, well, what about weed control? Because the single cut doesn't grow tall like the double cut. And that's right. But it grows thick and lush and close to the ground, and so it's still going to give really good weed competition for the annual weeds, just as good probably as the double cut. because the annual weeds hopefully germinate, after that wheat comes off, or they're down low in the canopy, and the clovers will outcompete them or minimize their growth. It might not give quite as good a control with things like sow thistle, the perennial weeds, but actually then when you spray them, you can get better coverage on the sow thistle rosettes, and it actually might be better from a weed control standpoint. James asking, on the clover note, what about fall seeding clover when you plant the wheat? We have only had success about 50% of the time with that, but Blair responding that he's had pretty good luck. My concern there, absolutely, is if the clover establishes and makes it through the winter, how competitive is it with the wheat crop? And James saying, well, I assume you should use single cut. And the answer to that is no, don't do it, because single cut needs to be vernalized. Once it's vernalized, it's like double cut on steroids, and it will grow big and tall and really compete with the wheat. If you're going to seed it in the fall, it would be double cut, full stop from that standpoint. Hey, while I'm on that note, even our own Real Ag Lindsay reaching out to Wheat Pete saying, hey, we've got a pasture. We overwinter our ewes on the pasture. The grass is getting a bit thin. We have some seed left over that we could spread out there. What are the chances of success? And my answer is, the ewes are out there, great. Spread the seed and leave the ewes out there for a couple more weeks, as long as it's not super muddy, to allow them to kind of get that seed pushed into the soil with those little hooves, right? But then you got to pull them off, because if you leave them out there, the little seedlings come up and emerge, and they will nip them off. Sheep are so good at grazing close to the ground, and those tiny, tender shoots, they'll be done. But pull them off, and now the grass is beat up a bit. It's not as competitive. That new seed is incorporated a little bit. I think you have good chance of success, so that next year, when you put the woolly pigs out on there will be a little bit more there for them to chew on. Okay, let's move on to some questions. We had a great discussion last night about wheat and nitrogen, and we've had this actually several different locations over the last little while. And Jim asks a great question. I have thin wheat. It's thin where the water laid, like it was a tough fall, and I know it's thin. What can I do from a management standpoint to support that thin wheat? And Jack reaching out to me saying, I've got November wheat. Is it time for nitrogen? Well, okay, so first off, on thin wheat, on November wheat, the answer is early nitrogen, absolutely. That's one of the things you can do. You want some early nitrogen there to support the plants that are there and hopefully stimulate some tillering. Also, Jim, on the thin wheat or the November wheat, Jack, weed control, because you're not going to have the same level of weed control. So weed control in the spring probably becomes more important. Jim, if you're putting red clover on with thin wheat and applying that clover in the spring, it must be single cut, because double cut will compete now because it'll shoot to flower, whereas the single cut hasn't been vernalized. So then it all comes back to how early is too early for that nitrogen on the wheat crop. And as Dr. Dave described last night, man, it is simply low demand. So even though we want early nitrogen, February or early March nitrogen, unless you're in Essex County, any nitrogen before the 15th of March, the chances of getting response are incredibly close to zero. And why is that? It's because there's no demand. The wheat has barely got any new root growth. It needs new root growth to pick up the nitrogen. And so we need that new root growth before we have any demand for nitrogen. And those tiny little plants, the nitrogen demand really stays low. So if we do apply nitrogen, we have a really high risk of loss, because it can either be leached too far down in the soil profile, or more likely it can be denitrified if it stays warm and it gets wet. And February was so dry, we're going to get wet at some point to balance that out, right? The law of averages will get close to average most of the time. You lose that by denitrification with no demand, and that's gone for good. Plus, it can be an environmental concern. So you look at all that and you say, well, the potential for return is almost zero. The risk is quite high. So no, it's definitely too early for nitrogen. if it stays warm like it did in 2012 and it's 24 degrees on the 20th of March or 24th of March, then we get to that second half of March and that early nitrogen, by then you want to stimulate some growth so that early nitrogen becomes okay. But up until this point, at that point, the chances of any benefit really are small. Having said that, man, the yen, such great information in the yen. Got a slide from Aaron Mills. I posted on Twitter, and since they started the yen project in Prince Edward Island, wheat yields there, winter wheat yields there, it's just almost like a straight line yield increase that they've never seen before. And so don't forget, correlation is not causation, but man, there's something going on there. And I think they're focusing more on management, and every grower in Ontario knows that management pays. So that part is really cool. And then we get Jan in Kent County, Chatham, Kent, saying, I'm aiming for 150 bushel wheat. That's 4 tons per acre. If you're a ton per acre person, that's big wheat here in Ontario. And so he did go out and put on his ammonium sulfate just to have that there to early stimulate. And Mark Davis, we've talked about Mark, he did some strips in some fields as well. So when you're pushing hard, well, okay, that 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate is only 21 pounds of nitrogen. It's not high risk because the amount is small. And the sulfur, we're not going to lose the sulfur the same. So there is some options there if you really want to push. But for most of the nitrogen, it's simply too early. Full stop on that discussion. Hey, just before I leave all this, I want to mention the yen again because 200 participants this year. That's amazing. They have participants in North Carolina and in Washington State, and it's the Great Lakes yen. It just so makes me laugh. But what that tells you is that it's such a good program that you can just really focus in on management, and people all across North America are keen to do that. That is very neat stuff. Okay, I got to finish up here quickly. Josh out of North Dakota saying, okay, Peter, I want to talk about nitrogen on my wheat crop, and I generally had applied all my nitrogen in the fall. That's a typical thing in Western Canada throughout the northern part of the U.S. Midwest. But based on some of the things you said, I tried in 2022, I put 50 on in the fall, and in the spring of 22 then I came in and I applied 60 pounds of nitrogen. That's my typical normal nitrogen application. And oh my gosh, 10 bushel per acre more yield, 0.6% higher protein level, a full mile per hour faster at harvest. Mile per hour faster at harvest, I don't quite fathom how that worked, but I'll take it. And so in the fall of 22, I went out there and I just put on that same 50. And in the spring of 23, she was brutally dry. And I just thought there isn't the yield potential there. I did some trials with no added nitrogen, with only 40 of added nitrogen. And that was sort of the average that I picked for most of my acres. And I did some strips at 60 added nitrogen. And gosh, at the end of the day, the 0 added nitrogen was actually the highest yield. And I sort of think I might have left some yield on the table because I didn't put more fall nitrogen down. So great thought process. So this fall, by the way, the fall of 23, Josh put 60 pounds down in the fall, and he's just wondering, how does that come together? And this is the dilemma with nitrogen, and the same thing happens in the spring. Barry and Tyler and I had a great discussion about corn nitrogen. You don't want to put it all on up front, but you need moisture if you put it on later. And Greg Stewart and Tony Vine having a good discussion on Tech Talk Tuesday about that a couple of weeks ago. Barry saying, oh my gosh, they're making me think what I do through again. But at the end of the day, you have to put enough on up front that if you don't get rain or the rain is delayed, that you don't short yourself. But if you put it all on up front, you've taken away all the management opportunities. So Josh, in your case, the big question was, if you had to put on 80 in the fall, would that have brought more yield to the table? Or was really that 50 in the fall, full stop, the maximum economic rate because you were so dry? And we'd need some data to sort that out. Barry and Tyler on their corn program, they're putting 80 to 100 on up front, and that's actually split between the strip till and the broadcast in a weed and feed. And so environmentally, those are two separate time frames, so that's an environmental win. And then they're coming in at V12 and variable rate applying based on what they've seen. So I think it's a really great program. My only comment would be is that V12, that super late application, as both Tony and Greg alluded to, we just open ourselves up to a little more risk, and we really don't have good yield response to later nitrogen. So maybe shave that a bit earlier. But man, I love people thinking through the nitrogen thought process, but at the end of the day, it is a balance, and every year the answer is going to be slightly different. So you have to kind of hedge your bets around how you do nitrogen. Okay, that's a too long dissertation about nitrogen, but it is such a complex thing that we just got to keep talking about it. That's it. That's all. On behalf of the team here at Real Agriculture, this is Wheat Pete with the word for Wednesday, February the 28th. Hey, keep the questions coming, keep the comments coming, and I'll be back next week to talk too much yet again. See you then.